Apologies, I think that we've run a few minutes late, but we can make up for that 5-10 minutes by sitting longer than 15 minutes.
That's a court question. Thank you, Clary. Dr. Perumal, getting back to Exhibit E, maybe we can just go to paragraph 16 under abdomen.
Yes, my lady explained that there was no abnormality of the mucosa or the lining of the stomach, and prior to the adjournment I explained about the examination and why I didn't find any blood.
Thank you. Just take us through these paragraphs. I think you can go reasonably superficially insofar as you made no findings, and I don't think there's anything in dispute here.
Exactly. I made no finding, but except for paragraph 18, as I explained to my lady that there was mucosa showed no pathology.
I'm not suggesting you didn't examine them properly, but we can go through them superficially for our purpose.
Yes. Basically, it showed no pathology, no injury, except for the only point is 26, the genital organs, non-pregnant, and 3 fibroids were identified within the uterine wall. And next is the specimens that I took. I took sections for histology, my lady, right at the bottom of page 8, and I have a report dated 13th of August, and
let's just go to that. Without going through the ipsissima verba of the report, and bearing in mind that you've already dealt with your microscopic evaluation of the lungs, is there anything of particular significance under the brain, the heart, the liver, and the other organs?
no. The single one point we take away from here is multi-organ congestion. It's non-specific, but in the context, it's in keeping with an asphyxial death.
Right. Now, I want to go back to the ligature mark. And I just want to remind you of some of the evidence that's been placed on record. There were no photographs of the back of the neck emanating from Dr. Khan or any of his associates. You know that.
That's correct, yes. I'm aware of that.
They also did not observe or describe any ligature mark on the posterior aspect of the neck.
That's correct.
You did observe and describe a ligature mark on the posterior aspect of the neck, and we've seen your photographs and you've pointed it out to us.
Yes.
Now, in an attempt to explain the difference between your findings and your photographs and their non-findings, Dr. Khan and then later Dr. Abrams produced in court Exhibit 1, which was a wooden block that gets used locally, as I understand it, particularly in cases where bloodless neck dissections are to be performed. Now, my first question to you is, do you know and have you ever used or come across a block like that?
Yes. In fact, if one looks at my photos, it might just be a picture. Sorry, man. The photos that I'm referring is Triple H. Didn't make reference to photo 43. I was earlier on looking for a proper picture of the ECG adhesive pad. 43, that's an ECG adhesive pad probably put on by the paramedics on their arrival. Now, if you, one of the photos here, my lady, is a photograph that shows the block. Now, you can't see it in photo 1 clearly, but it's there. And then it's present in photo number 6. You can just see one section there.
Right.
Just point in that direction. Photo number 11, it's the white background behind the head. So it's and then of course we see it probably best in photo number 15. So I'm familiar with that.
Pardon me, which number is it? Oh, it's right.
15. Now, can I just comment on the
Yes,
ligature imprint?
please do.
My lady, it is very, very important in our practice, and especially in the context here where there's a description of a ligature that is absent, the imprint is absent. Although if I may say in exhibits, Annexure C, Exhibit C, one can see that the ligature imprint is going to the back at photo 11.
Annexure C of Exhibit C.
C.
Right.
Photo 11. Just one photo there. So it is critical. A negative finding in forensic pathology is as important as a positive finding. And it's unfortunate that there's not a single photograph showing this important negative finding.
At the first autopsy.
Correct. The next point, my lady, is that in the number of second autopsies that I've done, I've never seen this particular mark being left by what is called, we refer to it as the neck block. The next point, my lady, is, and I don't know if I can have that mannequin closer to me, if I can demonstrate something while that's being done. I want to explain the mechanics of this block to the neck and how it's used on the deceased when we're performing. You don't have to fix it, you can just hold it here if you don't mind. My lady, that block is put on the neck and it will touch on one end, cervical spine number 7, and in the other end, it will touch the occipital scalp. There is no way that edge of the block, solitary edge, can be in the middle of the neck, as we see anatomically here, to create such a mark. The next point is, that is a tram line. This is not a single mark, it's a tram line. It's got clearly 2 lines with a clear center. Physically, for that instrument to cause that injury is almost impossible. Next point, my lady. In terms of the procedure, it is put at the back of the neck. So as I mentioned, the edges of it is not on the neck itself. Primarily to get the head opened. That's a quick procedure. In this particular context, the area where that block would be positioned the longest is when the neck is examined, because remember the rest of the organs are taken and examined separately. It will be over the shoulder blades.
Or under the shoulder blade.
Sorry, yes, under the shoulder blades. Now, the reason for that, my lady, is the allowing of drainage of blood from the thoracic inlet to go into the chest, and from the, once the brain is removed, the blood to drain backwards. So you've got to have if the neck blockage here is not going to drain, it's got to be under the shoulders to allow the neck to extend and drain, and then to allow quite a drop for the blood vessels, because you want to create a bloodless field. So I'm not at all convinced that this is a post-mortem artifact. I've never seen such a thing. And the characteristic of this mark, I cannot see how it's caused by the neck block.
Can I just...
And without being disrespectful, I think if you're looking at it, it's more likely be an observer error, because already the ligature imprint was described as being parchment, being blanched throughout the neck, and it's clearly, even at the scene, and my lady, I'm convinced that this photo has not been, thank you, it's a virgin, pristine condition, nobody has fiddled with it or interfered with it. The photograph that I've showed, for example, 11 of Annexure C of Exhibit C, is clearly an observer error in terms of observing fundamentally the ligature. If anything is fundamental in this case, it's a proper observation of the ligature. And in my eyes, that's an error in the observer.
Have a look at your photographic bundle, Exhibit HHH, and in particular, photograph number 14, amongst others.
And 15. 15, you can see there's a tramline abrasion a little more clearly.
Well, whichever one you prefer. Is the block capable of causing that sort of effect?
No, if it's going to cause that effect, if anything, it will have to go around the neck, because it's meant to sit in that position.
Right. Now, above those marks, on both of these, you see certain darkened areas.
Yes.
Do you have any comment about that? Sort of darker red than in between the tram lines. Would you comment on that?
Darker red between the tramline, did you say?
No?
Above it.
Above it.
Yes. That's probably lividity. Post-mortem lividity, more accurately.
Now, I want to remind you of some evidence that was led in this matter that played a very prominent role in this case until the cross-examination of Dr. Khan by myself. And that was a determination of the time of death. Now, I'm going to try and summarize the evidence for you. Initially, Dr. Khan said that he prepared his incident scene report and that he sent it to Dr. Abrams, but that was his final report. She had no say in it or made no amendments to it. She actually differed from him in that regard and indicated that insofar as his estimate of the time of death was concerned, she saw to her mind that his calculations were wrong and she changed them and advised him accordingly. Can you recall that?
I do recall that, my lady.
And so the upshot was, in his final report, forgetting now the disparity between him and her on that evidence, in his final report and in his testimony, he said the following: that death occurred at 5:40 a.m. on Sunday the 24th of July 2016, and there was a 95% probability that it occurred at that time. Do you recall that?
I recall that, my lady.
Now, during the course of his cross-examination, it was put to him that in calculating the time of death, he had made numerous fundamental errors. And amongst other things, it was pointed out to him that he hadn't measured the temperature on the floor, that he hadn't taken into account the possibility of sunlight or something through the window of the bathroom, that he hadn't measured the temperature of the bedroom, that he hadn't mentioned the ambient temperature in the bedroom, and that amongst other things it emerged then that he was calculating in terms of the Henschke nomogram on the basis of having taken the rectal temperature, and it actually turned out that he hadn't taken the rectal temperature, he'd taken the temperature in the ear, and he hadn't specified whether it was the external auditory canal or the temperature of the thermometer against the eardrum. We don't know
Tympanic
yet.
membrane, yes.
All of those factors, let's set them aside for a moment and just assume that he did all those things correctly. I then put it to him that even then his calculation was totally flawed, and that the best he could do in terms of estimating the time of death on the basis of the Henschke nomogram was to say that there was a 95% chance that death occurred during the period from 2.8 hours before 5:40 and 2.8 hours after 5:40. Can you recall that?
Yes.
After a bit of cross-examination and everything, he eventually concurred that he had made this fundamental error, and in fact had repeated the same error in something in the order of 50 other post-mortems that he'd done. Do you recall that?
50 other scene examinations, yes.
Pardon me. Right. Then the testimony of Dr. Abrams came along, and she adamantly refused to accept these submissions that were put to her. Now, various authorities were also put to her, and the court even asked her certain pertinent questions, but she remained adamant. Now I have here an extract from a book written, amongst others, by Professor Henschke, and the co-authors are Professor Bernard Knight. You have one of those.
I have one. Thank you,
Could
my
have
lady.
that to the court, please. Professor Bernard Knight and other leading experts, one of whom I recognize, even Madia.
Yes.
Now, I'm not going to deal at length with the nomogram and the calculations and the methodology involved, because Dr. Loftus has made this particular study of that. I'm sure you also know that Dr. Loftus has taught and lectured at the University of Stellenbosch.
That's correct.
Department of Forensic Pathology. And But I want to take you to this book. Now, would this be regarded as a leading authority on this issue?
Most certainly, my lady.
Is there any dispute on that point?
No.
Right. And this particular edition was published in 1995. So it's been around for a long time and should be known by most pathologists.
Yes, can I just quickly comment on something?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. My lady, every fourth-year medical student who is taught forensic pathology, most important, fundamental, foundational basis for forensic pathology is thanatology. In other words, what happens after death. And the most important thing, it's even below Forensic 101, is the determination of the time of death. If a student comes for oral exam and doesn't know this, he fails. If a pathologist is going to the scene and his primary, I'm talking about pre-autopsy visit to the scene, and if his primary objective, amongst others, is to determine the time of death, and does not understand the principles of this nomogram, it's in a very, very sad state. Very, very sad state.
Now, against the background of the knowledge being involved in calculating this being forensic pathology 101, if we look at this article that has been extracted, or this extract from the book,
Yes.
I'm not going to deal with you through all these pages. I want you to go to the page marked 89, and my lady, may I request that this be handed up as Exhibit Triple K, please?
Thank you. So long.
So let there not be any doubt remaining on this score. From your point of view, Dr. Perumal, can we go to the second column? Now I'm going to traverse the first column and the second column in more detail with Dr. Loftus, because the miscalculation of the time of death in this case played an incredibly significant role in determining whether or not there was a case against Mr. Rohde. Let's just look at the second paragraph, and I'm going to read it. The successful use of the nomogram method requires experience. As with any medical legal procedure, it is very easy to read of the time since death from the nomogram or to compute it. However, especially after computing the time of death, this gives the impression of high accuracy, which leads to the danger of misuse and misinterpretation.
Exactly.
Okay, so I take it you agree with that
I
statement.
do.
First, the estimation of the time since death by any method of examination of the body is really the task of a forensic pathologist. You won't
Correct.
dispute that.
Correct.
Right. Second, the indicated value read from the nomogram, or if you're using a computer program, the computed time of death is a mean value, a misleading part of the full result.
Correct.
Now, just tell me what that means.
It means, in this case, you cannot say that the time of death is 05 hours 40.
That's the mean of
That's
the
correct.
times.
Yes.
Let's carry on. The interval limited by the permissible variation of 95% is the one and only result, the death occurred with the probability of 95% within this interval. A more precise indication of the interval since death cannot be obtained according to all the results of scientific investigation.
Agreed.
Now, if we go to the present case and just do a little calculation, it can be rough. The finding was, and we once again just accepting for the sake of argument, that Dr. Khan didn't make all those observational errors. Okay. Essentially, the time interval of 2.8 hours before 5:40 takes us to 10 to 3 in the morning.
Thereabout, yes. Yes.
And on the other side, to 8:30 in the morning.
That's
Now,
correct.
as I put it to Dr. Abrams, the most accurate that you can say in this case is that death occurred with a 95% probability at some or other time between 2:50 and 8:30 that morning.
Correct, but there's still that 5% chance it occurred outside of those periods.
Oh, I forgot that. So it could even be later or earlier.
Earlier.
And that's the best you can do.
Absolutely.
So to just refer to, I suppose one could say, pulp fiction, all these cases which we watch on television, which the doctor comes onto the scene and says, death occurred at 1:15 this morning. Is there any merit in that?
No, but that's where it stays. It just stays with TV. It's not practicable. It's not applicable scientifically. My lady, as I said yesterday, the challenge in forensic pathology, firstly, is to make proper observations. But the bigger challenge is interpreting observations. If we, and it's not a serious issue not measuring the temperature of the floor and the sunshine coming through. It's not a material aspect in this case. It's there, but the material aspect is, even if the external auditory meatus was measured and not the rectum, I can still work with it. I can work with the ambient temperature, whatever was used. But what I'm really saddened by is the inability to be able to take these facts and apply and interpret it using science and logic. That is unfortunately a fundamental flaw in the assessment of the time of death.
Now let's accept that instead of using the rectal temperature for whatever reason you choose, you decide as a forensic pathologist to measure the temperature in the either the external auditory canal or the tympanic temperature.
Yes.
Is it necessary to, and then you use a conversion formula to translate that into probable rectal temperature, and then you go to the nomogram.
Yes.
Is that not something that should be recorded, that you've done it?
My lady, it should be recorded, but I think in the bigger scheme of things, in terms of determining what we call the post-mortem interval, it wouldn't play a bigger role as the proper application of that information in terms of what the authors are saying. With anything, if someone's done the research and the author is telling you how to use their product, we have to stick with that unless we challenge it, in which case we're not challenging it. So we should be doing exactly what the author said.
Let's go back to page 89 of this extract, where it says the next paragraph, third, using the nomogram method, the interval of death that is obtained is calculated by, via factors which are themselves either measures or evaluations.
Yes.
What are they saying there?
What they're saying, for example, if Mrs. Rohde has been lying naked on a cold tile, that will mean that's one of the factors that will accelerate heat loss. So you bring in that factor on either end of your spectrum. You've got to factor that in. if there was a cold wind, if the window was open and a cold wind was blowing through, that's another factor that will accelerate. On the other hand, if she was in the bed with her pajamas and covered with a duvet, then the heat loss would be slower. So what the scientists are saying here, this is a guideline for you that you should follow, but just factor in other things and then you can read it off the nomogram.
So that's, I take it, when they say you can use the right rules but get the wrong results if the factors are wrong.
That's right.
And then the most important thing, and certainly often the most difficult one, is to analyze these factors carefully at the scene of crime.
That's right.
Okay. Now, in terms of authority and status in the field of forensic pathology, can you beat the combination of authors of this book?
My lady, in terms of international standing and authority, the three people, well-recognized experts, are number 1, Henske, 2, Knight, 3, Madeira. I personally do not see anyone else having any more authority on the subject than these 3 writers.
Now, let's move back to your photographic album. Are there any other photographs that you haven't touched on yet that you would like to refer to? Let's maybe, just for the sake of absolute completeness, go to photographs 41 and 42, because you did discuss the lungs, and I don't want to traverse ground that's already been covered.
Yes.
But just point out to us what are the petechial hemorrhages, and also point out on the next photograph what the ecchymosis, what these are.
Okay. My lady, photo 41 of Triple H, those red spots on the pleura. Pleura is a covering, the lining of the lung. Those red spots are petechial hemorrhages.
These little sort of pin-prick spots.
That's correct.
Pinpoint.
Yes.
Pinpoint.
It's like the back of an office pin, as I said. The sizes.
Sorry, the
just
back of?
Of an office pin. The size is just basically a collection of those. And 42, my lady, there's a darker area. One can see isolated petechial hemorrhages just above it, but there's a darker area on the lung. That's an ecchymosis. It's a larger hemorrhage. But my lady, I'd also like to, just for complete sake, draw your attention to photo 37. That's what a hyoid bone looks like. It's a U-shaped bone.
Photo
37.
37.
Triple H.
Now, I just want to pause for a moment and deal with once again your opinion and knowledge in regard to injuries and fractures of the hyoid bone and the thyroid cartilage. Let me start by asking you the following. Is the presence of a fracture of the hyoid bone diagnostic of any particular type of death? In other words, if there's a fracture of the hyoid bone, this person has been manually strangled. Or if there's a fracture of the hyoid bone, this person has been hanged or has hanged herself. Can you comment on that? And then I'll ask the same question for the thyroid cartilage.
My lady, the skeletal structures in the neck, which will include the hyoid bone and the thyroid cartilage, can be injured, can be fractured in both circumstances: manual strangulation and hanging. More and more prospective studies are showing the higher incidence observed in hanging. But it's still more prevalent in manual strangulation than in hanging, but we're beginning to see more studies showing that the incidence is much higher in hanging than we thought. So the presence or even the absence of these skeletal injuries do not support either.
Do not prove.
Either way, doesn't prove.
So why is there such a hype about fractures of the hyoid bone or the thyroid cartilage?
I think it's an historical thing, like the classic signs of asphyxia.
Those obsolete quintet.
Yes. Now, if I can comment in terms of what pathology the hyoid bone is showing here. My lady, I think it's beyond discussion that it's not fractured or there's no dislocation at the joints. So we put that aside. I think there's agreement. But what it shows is a focus of hemorrhage on the inner side of the hyoid bone, the inner aspect. So, my lady, if we can look at photo number 37, I think it was that I just showed. My lady, I'll just point to the external. That's the external surface, the outer part, and that's the inner surface, the inner part. What both Dr. Khan and myself observed was a small hemorrhage on the inner aspect. Now, let's try and understand that in this context. Because it's interpretation now we're looking at. It certainly isn't pressure from the outside with the digits. In other words, if somebody had put their hand on the neck of this person, this Mrs. Rohde, the pressure is going to come from external to inwards, outside to inwards. If there was going to be direct trauma from the digits or fingers, then I'm expecting to see some sort of external manifestation. If it's not fractured or dislocated, at least to see this focus of hemorrhage. Now, what is the explanation in this case? The explanation is that when the deceased, as I indicated in the pathophysiology, my lady, is there's convulsions, there's, because of the anoxia, there's movement, because remember the head and neck is the heaviest organ in the body, the brain. With the movement of the head, with this tension and the tension within the neck structures, and my colleagues have observed a hemorrhage at the thyrohyoid membrane, which is attached to the inside of the hyoid bone. That tension is causing this injury, not direct pressure. So it's more related to the anoxic episode rather than direct external pressure or trauma. I've just answered that. So you cannot use, in this circumstance, you cannot, because, my lady, if one looks at this pathology, probably the most significant one is the fracture, which even if I have to accept it's an ante-mortem fracture that was observed and it's not an autopsy artifact. Let's assume it's not an autopsy artifact. It's a true ante-mortem fracture of the superior horn of the cornu of the thyroid cartilage. That is the commonest skeletal structure injury in hanging. And there's tons of literature necessary, I can go through it, but I'll make that point now and I'll support it subsequently. But just to say, if I'm forced to accept that, and I've got no issue accepting it as an ante-mortem injury, absolutely. But if it is, it's the commonest skeletal structure injury in hanging.
So, when it comes to the thyroid cartilage and the alleged fracture of the one superior horn, your interpretation is, and I know I will lead Dr. Loftus to share that view, is that that was an injury caused during the dissection process, in other words, an autopsy artifact. But even if you were to be incorrect, and even if it was an ante-mortem injury, it's the commonest injury you find with hanging.
That's correct. Commonest skeletal injury.
Okay, skeletal injury, right. I'm going to get back to your finding as you set it out in your post-mortem examination report, but I just want to at this stage ask you one question. You've heard the version of events of Mr. Rohde, or you've read it?
I've read it mainly in the transcript.
Argument and fight, if I could call it that, with his wife. Then he wanted to leave the hotel room, and then the trip all around the various hotel rooms, her falling, we know that she cut her foot, we know that she fell in the garden bed on a little wall. You've seen, or you've heard, or you've read all of that.
That's correct, my lady.
Okay. Now my question to you is, and you've also heard his version of events, that when they unlocked the door, he found his wife at Angus.
Yes.
Is there any injury that you found, or any post-mortem observation that you made, which rules that version of events out? In other words, which is inconsistent with Mr. Rohde's testimony?
No, there's nothing that I can specifically say that is totally inconsistent with the version that he has put before this court.
My lady, I'm not exactly sure of the time, and I know that the court generously offered to sit for a few more minutes, but I'm now at a point where I'm about to deal with two aspects, and that is the exhibit JJJ that was handed in, and a whole bundle of authorities to support the views of Dr. Perumal, which I intend to hand in. None of these authorities is new, but I've just collated them to bring them into one bundle so that we don't have to go from one already handed in exhibit to another, just to try and make it easier. Would this be a convenient time for the court to adjourn until tomorrow?
Okay, I think we can. And the court is nodding approval. Thank you. We proceed tomorrow at 9:30.
As the court please.
Dr. Perumal, thank you very much. We will proceed tomorrow with your testimony, Mr. Rohde. Your bail's extended on the same terms. We'll see you tomorrow.
As the court please.